Hi, everybody. We're really excited to be here and have Norman with us for his new book launch. Now, full disclosure, the book is actually not out yet. At the time of this recording, it's coming out in January. So it's just, for me, it's perfect because I can host this while feeling like I had to read the book in advance, but I'll definitely have to read it when it comes out in January. We're also really excited to have Norman here, who's been a huge influence on us. And specifically, this book is interesting because over the last year, as Hazelnut, we formed a learning community around the idea of hope in a time of ecological disaster. And having lots of deep conversations, one of the things we came out with is that hope is not easy. It's not easy to be bottled, it's not easy to access. It's a bit more complex than we would want it to be, but it is worth fighting for, and it is good. So we are really excited to have Norman. We're really happy to have you come and share your wisdom tonight. So over to you.
All right. Thanks so much, John. It's great to be with you all. I'm glad you made the time. And yeah, the book came out in the US at the end of October, and I just naively assumed that that would happen in other places too, but I did not correctly assume that. So I hope that you can be patient. So let me tell you a little bit about how this book came to be and what I was doing in approaching it in a very particular kind of way. And then I'll read a little bit from the beginning of the book to give you a sense for the flavor of the book, because it's a different kind of writing that I've done in this one. It's much more narrative driven. And that was a deliberate choice because hope is one of these elemental words which can very easily move into realms of abstraction and conceptual analysis. And some of that can be really useful. But you have to remember, and this is something I learned very early on in the process of writing the book, is that so many people are deeply suspicious of the term hope. And so if I was going to try to use this term in a way that might have some resonance with younger people, but not just younger people, I realized I was going to have to give very thick descriptions about what I mean when I talk about practices that come around the action of hope. Because if you don't do that and you just speak rather abstractly, you're going to lose people, and especially you're going to lose people if the person speaking those words is someone like me who has a position of comfort in our world. So I was thinking about what are the stories that are going to best motivate however we think about hope. And I wanted to also be clear then, we're living in a world which is presenting multiple crises all at one time. And I've been teaching a course, a university-wide course at Duke with undergraduates called Let's Talk About Climate Change. And so I've heard directly from many of them, and I have adult children myself, and in conversations with them and their friends, it's becoming very clear that the pressures, the crises that they feel, which are multiple, right? Climate change is certainly one of them, but so too is polarization, so too is wealth inequality, so is the kind of political turmoil that we are especially sensing here in the United States right now. These are weighing very heavily on them, so much so that a number of them have said we're not planning to have children, which is a major thing to come to. And I wanted to say, well, I don't want to just say have hope, right? They're tired of elderly, comfortable people saying, don't give up the faith, just have hope and believe that everything will be wrong. I mean, everything will be fine in the end. And also just the idea that calls to optimism can actually be harming our people, our communities, because optimism, which I want to distinguish very clearly from hope, optimism is a status quo concept, because what optimism says is that somehow, somewhere, sometime, things are going to be all right. And when you take that posture, you're assuming that the way things now uh, are basically fine, and we just have to hang on, and things will be good in the end. And that's exactly the wrong approach to take, because, as I argue in the book, things as they now are precisely what's precipitating our despair, our anger, our lament about the world that we're in. And so, if we're going to talk about hope, we have to be very clear that we're not talking about optimism, because hope registers in many different ways, as I try to show in the book, but it certainly registers in one moment as protest against a world which is doing so much damage, about economies, political systems, even infrastructures, that make it very difficult for people to sense that the future is one that they feel compelled to give themselves to in varying forms of work and service and commitment. So that's sort of the general orientation for why I wanted to write this book. And I also wanted to be very clear that when I'm talking about hope, I'm not talking about hope as much as a noun and more of hope. And the reason that's important is because when I hear people talk about hope, it often sounded like something people have. Some people have it, some people don't. And if you have it, you're lucky because hope is presumed to act something like a security blanket or maybe a vaccine that protects you from trouble. And it's sad that maybe some people don't have it, and so they don't feel secure or they don't feel safe. And I don't find that way of speaking very helpful, partly because it renders folks fairly passive. And so I wanted to try to talk about hope much more as a verb, something that people commit themselves to. It's a way of being, and it's a way of being that is fundamentally grounded in God's own hopeful ways with the world, right? That we live in a world which is fully and beautifully and mysteriously and diversely alive. And if we're going to play a role in creating futures for our communities and for ourselves that honor that life, we have to learn what are those life-giving ways that God puts into the world from the beginning and throughout. So hope is not something that we give to the world. Hope is something that we participate in, and it's a fundamentally a form of loving existence. So that's some of the general stuff I want to say, and now I'd like to read a little bit from the introduction to the book, which is a story which was important to me because as I was thinking about how to write this book, I needed to find what's going to be the angle that's going to hold the book together. And I had been thinking about Ecclesiastes, which is a bit of an unlikely source because if you've read Ecclesiastes, you know it's a fairly grim book. It's fairly honest about the many problems and questions that human beings deal with all the time. But there's a verse in there, which is chapter 9, which says, "There is hope for those who are joined with all the living." And I thought this is an arresting claim to be made by Kohelet, and I thought that's exactly the kind of approach I want to take in the book. And the question then became, how do we talk about joining? Because joining with all the living is not a simple thing. It's a difficult thing and requires all sorts of capacities that need to be developed in ourselves and in each other. And so I was actually in Oxford several years ago, and I was in Blackwell's, and I love just looking at bookshelves, and I saw this little book called The Optician of Lampedusa, which tells a story that I'm going to tell you about now. And in reading that story, suddenly the book came to fruition in my mind, which is a wonderful thing if you're a writer and you're trying to figure out how to get something done. So let me read to you from the introduction from this book called Love's Braided Dance. And just another word, the title, Love's Braided Dance, is from a poem that Wendell Berry wrote called In Rain. And the poem is a description about how, as a farmer, one lives on land which is never simply your land, but is land that has been dwelt within by former people, many, many creatures, histories of living and germination, but also histories of death. And the poem has this stanza: "The way I go is marriage to this place, grace beyond chance, love's braided dance, covering the world." So that's where the title for this book comes from. So let me read now. It was supposed to be a short holiday, the last boating excursion of the season for Carmine and Rosaria Menia to join with 6 of their closest friends to enjoy the pleasures of the sea. Their plan was to remain in sight of the coast of Lampedusa, their small island home in the Mediterranean, located between a glorious evening swim in the cove, along with the gentle rocking of the boat, had provided a good night's rest. The dawn promised a sunny and peaceful day in which to cruise about and fish. But when Carmine emerged on deck, his peace was interrupted by the squawking sound of what he thought to be a flock of seagulls. When his friends joined him on deck, they said, "Something is screaming." It wasn't seagulls they heard, it was people, hundreds of them, thrashing in the water, yelling with all their might, desperate for help. As Carmine steered his boat to the scene, he and his companions encountered the floating debris of a sunken vessel, along with discarded clothing and shoes. They saw the dead. They saw faces gasping and choking, many of them struggling. And how long had they been in the water? How long were they exhausted? The sea writhed from so many people kicking and flailing to stay afloat. How long before they lost the energy to keep trying? Carmine thought to himself, "They are all drowning. I can't possibly save them all." His boat, the Galata, was built for a maximum of 10 people. Neither Carmine nor his friends had any training in ocean rescue. They also knew there are strict laws against aiding illegal immigrants. Carmine and his friends eventually managed to pull 46 men and one woman on board. They later learned that many of the migrant women and children had been trapped below the deck and drowned when their boat went down. So many hands begged to be grasped, so many agonizing choices had to be made. The friends decided to focus their efforts on clusters of people rather than on individuals, knowing that their decisions to rescue some consigned others to death. There wasn't much time. Those still alive had swallowed a lot of seawater and were visibly sick and exhausted. Their bodies were covered with a film of diesel fuel, making them slippery to hold on to. As more migrants were pulled on board, their weight risked capsizing the Galata. Like many others living in the Mediterranean region, Carmine knew that thousands of migrants tried to reach European shores every week. He also knew that many of them died in the attempt. The Mediterranean is known to be the world's deadliest border, claiming over 30,000 migrant lives since the year 2000, with many more victims unaccounted for. When Carmine heard news reports about the migrant crisis, he often turned the radio off. He wanted to live his own life, take care of his family, and keep his focus on his optometry business. Carmine didn't speak badly of the migrants that came upon Lampedusa's shores, or, like some others, complain publicly about how their presence was destroying local tourism. But he didn't visit them at the town reception center either. He was shy and reserved, not the sort of person who hugged freely. Carmine was surprised by the visceral attachment he suddenly felt pulling that first young man aboard. He wanted to hug and comfort him, like a protective parent. To this day, he has not forgotten the feel of the young man's hand in his, nor the power that flowed through his body as he reached out to grab hold of yet another person, wanting and willing each of them to survive. He says he never felt more alive in his life than at that very moment. His muscles tingled and his nerves sparked with energy. When the Coast Guard finally came, he could not fathom the captain's order to stop the rescue effort. Nothing in him wanted to steer the Galata back to shore. Months later, Carmine said, "I can still feel the fingers of that first hand I seized, how they consented, or cemented rather, into mine, bone grinding against bone, how they clamped down with such a grip that I saw the sinuous veins of the wrist pounding, the force of that hold. My hand in a stranger's hand in a bond stronger and more intimate than an umbilical cord, and my whole body shaking with the force of the hold as I pulled upwards and dragged the naked torso from the waves." It was the touch of another's hand and the feel of another's flesh that activated within him the power he describes as love. When the Galata came to shore and the migrants were taken by police and emergency staff to the reception center, he wanted to stay with them. He wanted to take their hands again, to talk to them. He wanted to sit down with them, to ask how they were, who they were, why they'd come. He wanted to know if the fishing boats or the Coast Guard had found their families, if they'd been reunited with their loved ones. He had to know what happened. He could not give up on them. In the days and weeks that followed, Carmine and his friends were overcome by grief. Each suffered in one way or another, with nightmares, panic attacks, insomnia, anger, or depression. Carmine had never felt such emotional intensity or sorrow. He also knew more pain was still to come because more boats would be coming every day, more hands grasping for help. Reporters came knocking, wanting to get the story, but Carmine wasn't interested in being portrayed as a hero. Replaying in his mind over and over again that terrible time, seeing the floating bodies of the dead, a total of 368 people died that day, and later learning that other boats ignored their cries for help, Carmine feels that he failed these people. Indeed, the cultures of Europe were failing these people. It wasn't lost on him that these migrants came from Eritrea, a former colony of Italy. The scene of rescue was also a scene of disaster because it signaled decades of Western economic and imperialist policies that weakened the local institutions of former colonies, decimated their traditions, displaced landholders, created millions of refugees, and then made them feel unwelcome when they fled hunger and fear and hopelessness. The rapid and recent creation of border walls in Europe, recalling that in 1989 there were 15 fortified walls, but by 2016 there were almost 70, with several more being planned. Right? The creation of these borders and the growing violence being directed at migrants indicated a startling failure to recognize and welcome these migrants as human beings, a striking refusal to offer help to others in need. As Carmine reflected on the day of rescue, he finally came to see these migrants as people who had a claim on his life. He insists that he was no one's savior. Instead, Carmine discovered how deaf he had been to the cries for help that sounded in his world, and how willfully ignorant he was about the policies and pressures pushing people to make the heart-wrenching, family-fragmenting choice to flee their homes. In an important sense, the migrants he rescued also rescued him because they put him in touch with life's meaning and purpose. They helped him recognize that the priorities by which he had organized his life needed to change. What he now knew was that he had an active role to play in creating a more hospitable world, a world that welcomed strangers and offered help to those who needed it. The migrants were strangers, but he came to feel a bond with them that went beyond friendship. The people he had rescued were on the brink of existence, and when he held their hands in his, when he watched them take their first breaths on the Galata's deck, he knew he had touched the very essence of life. They had looked him to live. The survivors didn't stay in Lampedusa. They were eventually moved on to destinations farther north. Carmine worried for them because he knew that a warm welcome was unlikely wherever they went. He knew that the refugee camps and detention centers they would meet along the way would chip away at their dignity and self-respect. Would the countries and communities that allowed them to stay also embrace them and partner with them in the construction of a new life? A year later, several came back to be with Carmine and his friends. They wanted to visit the site of the tragedy. The reunion was tearful and joyous. One survivor came running to Rosaria, embracing her in a tight hug, and showed her the t-shirt she had given him when he was first pulled on the Galata. It was the token of kindness he kept and needed as he journeyed through the degradation of refugee camps and detention centers. Two others presented a piece of paper to the group. It was a simple but beautifully executed drawing of a grasping hand coming out of the water and being met above by another hand which clasped it in a fierce grip. The friends and survivors sailed on the Galata to visit the site where they had first been brought together. When they arrived at the scene, the survivors asked that everyone join hands. Some prayed, some sang, some threw flowers into the ocean, some sobbed. As they prepared to return to shore, one of the teenagers pointed to the water and said, "That was where he died." He pointed to the deck of the Galata and said, "That was where he was born again." So that's the opening story as a way to try to make the point about how it's hand reaching to hand in need as a way to pull people together. Because what is so much behind, I believe, the despair and hopeless that many people feel is not simply that so many of our places and communities are being degraded, but they're also being abandoned, right? That they're not being shown the kind of devotion and care that signals that the places and the people living in them are worthy of anyone's investment. And so, for us to create a world in which something like hope can be born and grow, I believe one of the most important things that we can do is show first and foremost that other people and their places, their communities, their farm fields, their forests are worthy of our cherishing. Because it's only as people sense that they themselves and the world around them are cherishable that we're going to find people wanting and willing to give themselves to the good of each other and to the good of their communities. Now, there's a lot more that could be said about hope. I have chapters that talk about the importance of belonging, not just belonging with other people, but belonging to particular lands. I have a chapter talking about how technology is actually a hope eroding modality for many people. I have two chapters actually on forgiveness, because as important as it is to say that we should be joined with all the living, our attempts to join with others, even our best attempts, often involve us in varying forms of wrongdoing. And this is why it becomes so important that we learn to seek forgiveness, but also learn to grant forgiveness. And so I center two narratives in particular in these chapters. In the first, I talk about a farmer in Alberta, where I grew up, who describes what it was like to be forgiven by the land, which is a very striking story because we don't often think that the land might forgive or that the creatures of the land might forgive people. But I think it's a very important insight, especially as we're talking about a time where we're seeing so much degradation of our lands and our ecosystems. And in the second chapter on forgiveness, I talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened in South Africa, where Archbishop Desmond Tutu presided over a series of conversations and meetings and political decision making that had reconciliation at their heart. And he shows in these reconciliation hearings how important it is that people learn to forgive. And it wasn't something that he imposed upon people, it was presented to him by many of these very common people who came to testify and would describe how, in front of the people who had actually murdered and tortured or terribly abused their sons or their husbands, how in the presence of these victimizers, they decided how important it was to forgive the people who had done so much harm. And why that is such a vital characteristic of the life together that we need to imagine. And I know this is not an easy thing to say, because just speaking from my own context here, where, being in a place where there's so much anger about how the election went, and the anger directed, at people who you think, how I thought I knew you. And the question is, how do we learn to do forgiveness in a space where there's so much misunderstanding, so much suspicion? It's going to take time, but it's absolutely crucial that we learn to get there. And then I have two final chapters that were important to me, that also took the question of hope and the practice of hope into the realm of our economic life, but also into the realm of infrastructure. Because so much of the infrastructure that has been built in the last 100 years or more is actually a life deadening, a life destroying even kind of architecture that facilitates loneliness, that communicates to the people who live in them that they're not worth very much. And so I talk about what are the architectural and design principles that would be so important for us to follow as we try to build, literally build, a world in which the future can be more inviting for people. And then I have a last chapter on sympathy, because I argue that one of the terrible things about the economic forms that are so dominant in our world today is that they are entirely without sympathy. Sympathy for each other, sympathy for places, sympathy for the work that's being done. And I give some practical examples about how we can design economies that are actually making a large difference. And again, these are economies that are working well precisely because they are economies and workplaces that turn people to each other so that we can be a support to each other. Because in the end, what is going to create a hopeful future for us is when we join hands with each other in the ways of love and care and nurture. So I think I'll stop there so that we can now have some time for conversation.
Oh, thank you, Norman. That was absolutely fantastic. Really interesting, and very so different than your other books. So I'm really excited to pick this up as well. So yeah, if you've got questions, go ahead and put them in the chat or raise your hand. I'll look out for your hand as well, and we'll have a chat. While you're doing that, can I start with the first question? Just so everyone's getting warmed up. What do you do with? I was just thinking about this idea of hope that feels like we're in this culture right now where our hope is being taken from us, from kind of people at the top, and as they extract more from society, it feels like there's less kind of trickling down for the rest of us, and yet we're meant to look up to them and generate hope for ourselves, even though we've had hope taken from us.
Yeah,
Hope that makes sense. How do we live in a world like that? How do we function in a world like that?
yeah. Yeah, it's a really good question, John. I think there's a couple of things I want to say about it. For starters, we have to give up on the idea that the big man, and it's usually a man, is going to come along and save us. And there are two versions of it. On the one hand, there is the religious version where people just say, "Oh, God's got this," and you don't have to worry. Or you've got the techno version, which is Elon Musk has got this. And so you don't have to worry because there will be a technological solution that will save us. And I find both of those big man theories deeply troubling because what they do is they render us passive, right? We become what a friend of mine called ultimate bystanders who just wait for somebody else to fix the mess. And I've heard this repeatedly, right? I mean, yeah, the religious version takes the expression, God's in control. We have nothing to worry about. And I think that's evasion. It's not that God isn't powerful and that God isn't concerned, absolutely. But we should not think that that absolves us of any responsibility to describe the harms that are happening in our world and then work to address them. Because it is precisely through our addressing the woundedness, the abandonment, the degradation that we witness to God's love in the world. Right? So that's one side of the question. And the other is that we need to learn that hope lives in small action, in face-to-face encounter, in practical tasks happening in particular places, particular communities. It is definitely true that so many of the leaders, whether they be economic leaders, political leaders, and so forth, they often do not have our interests at heart. And this is revealed in so many ways when you think about the kind of wealth accumulation that's been happening in the top 1%. Um, there's very little regard for the many people who are seeing not just that their incomes aren't rising, but they're losing their jobs. They're, losing benefits. They're losing any sources of dignity because they don't have good living. They don't have good homes. So we need to realize that the big people, the powerful people, are not going to do much for ordinary people. But in the meantime, ordinary people, by turning to each other, can do a lot of good for themselves and for each other. Right? This is being revealed in all sorts of ways. Just recently in North Carolina, we had a major hurricane that came through, created unbelievable sites of devastation in the western part of the state, 2 to 3 feet of rain in some places. And so the flooding was enormous. Whole sections of towns were just washed away, they're gone. And one of the stories that I would hear is that, some people would say, well, the government now needs to step in and fix all this. And a lot of the folks there said, no, they already had networks within their communities, networks that were built over years, networks of friendship, networks of support. And these people came alongside each other. They didn't wait for somebody else to come. They just went to each other and they knew each other. They trusted each other. And even if they didn't have deep affection for each other, they knew that they were in this together. And so they were able to come side by side and begin the work of repair, the work of cleanup. And seeing community members do this was so inspiring to folks who thought that the polarization in America is just too great and that people will be just so suspicious. And the fact of the matter was that we had politicians who were trying to use the devastation as a way to cast more suspicion of the government, but also of neighbors. And neighbors said, no, we know each other. We've been with each other for years. We've worked together and we share a common love for our homes. And so that became a way to witness to an other way of being, another way of sharing life together. Because hope depends upon people feeling that they are nurtured, that they are cared for, that others value their existence and are going to work for their good, and that they invite you to join in that work by giving what you have to the good of others.
Oh, thanks. I really appreciate that. Let's keep this conversation going. If you want to raise your hand or write a question in the chat, now's a great time to do it. Let's see if we have a question coming. So Ron's written a question. Let me go ahead and read it out loud. Here's my question, though you may not hold on to it and not present until later in the conversation, but we're going to go for it now. It's a great time. In case you addressed it directly. All right. In Life After Doom, Brian McLaren, which is an excellent book. I heard him talk on this this summer. Fantastic, although very heavy topic. Talks about hope. He says that operating out of hope in catastrophic circumstances almost requires folks to be able to see a way through, to either see or imagine that there is some path through the difficulty, some possible solution future. He argues that acting out of love in contrast is the commitment to do the right thing, even if we don't see the path to a hopeful future. It's planting a tree knowing that you will never benefit from its fruit. Can you just say a bit about that contrast? So, yeah, definitely contrasting love and hope.
Yeah, no, it's a really good observation. One of the things I say in the book is that hope moves in the dark. And what I mean by that is we don't know the outcome of our actions. We never do. And, a line that was also important to me is from Wendell Berry, where he says, hope lives in the means, not the ends. And the presumption that we could know the ends, know the outcomes, is a very dangerous thing. And there's ample reasons to show that we don't know the outcomes. And, the example I often give is that if you had talked to people in the fall of 1989, experts, government leaders, business leaders, and said, do you anticipate that by the end of the year, the Berlin Wall will fall? Sir would have been, of course, it's not going to happen. There's no way the wall is going to come down. And then it did. And looking from the front end, nobody could see that as a possibility, right? The path to the wall coming down didn't exist. But looking from the other side, people saw that there were all sorts of small efforts that were being made on behalf of communities, on behalf of the well-being, and on behalf of the dignity of peoples. And those small actions all came together in surprising, unknown, unseen ways that then precipitated the wall coming down, right? So that's an example about what it means to act in the dark because you don't know. And this is where love is absolutely essential, right? When you love another or when you love a place, if you're honest, you know that you can't anticipate what the result of your love is going to be, right? Think about a parent who loves a child and does what they think is best for the child in the years that the child lives with them, but the child will be its own person. And the child might do things that will just destroy you, devastate you. But that doesn't mean that you don't love the child, right? If you only loved a child, if you believe that in the end they would be the kind of children you most want them to be, you wouldn't really love the child. You would be wanting to control the child, control their life, control their future. And controlling another is not to love another, right? So love, the best love is obviously the unconditional kinds of love that doesn't ever say, I will love you only if, you do this or have this or whatever, achieve this, right? So love is the kind of action that we give to each other and to our communities and to our places in which we do it because it's the right thing to do, right? We do it as a response to the love we experience being with others or the love we experience when we come upon a land and see what it does. I mean, one of the things I point to in the book where I talk about belonging and the importance of belonging, I draw here on Robin Kimmerer's work. Yeah, I'm sure many of you know of her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a wonderful book. But she talks about one of the most damaging things that happened in the American context is that Europeans came to this land with no intention to settle on it in a way that loved where they settled. They came to settle the land mostly to own it as private property or to mine it for its wealth. And as a result, by not giving their love to the land, they could not ever experience the love that the land had for them. And she says what this does is it creates a kind of psychosis, a kind of psychic disturbance within people because imagine what it would be like to grow up in a family where you did not feel that your parents loved you. As an adult growing up, you would have to develop all sorts of compensatory strategies to convince yourself and to others that you do matter because it's so important for people to believe that they matter if they're going to be successful as human beings. But Kimmerer's really valuable point is it's also important for you to know that your place, your land, actually loves you and can provide for you and cares for you by making available to us all the very things that we need to eat and drink and breathe and so forth. And she says, because so many people live in ways and in places where they can't ever sense the love of the land for them, they're living in a kind of disturbance. Because how do you affirm a life if everything that your life depends upon is not valued, right? So you either value it all or you can't really value any of it because it's an illusion to think that you can value people but not value their communities or their neighborhoods or their farms.
That's really
Al,
interesting.
Al Barrett has a question here.
Yeah, Alice says, can I follow on from this? What you've just said resonates with something you've written about before, powerfully as the dark night of the soil. Could you reflect a little more about how our paths towards hope might be entangled with that sense of living through that dark night and what might sustain us in those times and places?
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good question. I'm assuming that some of you are gardeners. I know that some of you are for sure, but I also know that some of you might not be. So I'll try to make this fairly simple. I've been growing food for a very long time. I'm not always very good at it and don't always give it the proper time and attention. But one of the things that you learn when you start to grow food is how little you actually know, right? There is so much to know whenever you try to grow anything. And so when you commit to growing a garden, and you spend a great deal of time trying to figure out how to do soil preparation. You figure out how to plant seed, when to plant seed, at what depth, how to water, how to take care of the germination that happens, and depending on what you're growing, what kinds of maintenance you have to do for the plant, how you have to be aware of disease, how you have to be aware of deer or stray animals that will come and eat what you're growing, or inclement weather, frost cycles. I mean, there's just so many things that you have to know, and you have to give yourself up to the fact that you're not going to know. And so, one of the most fundamental aspects of a gardener's or a farmer's education is that you need to come to terms with your own ignorance and your own impotence, right? That you can't know all that you need to know, and you don't have the power to get the results that you most want, which is why the experience of gardening brings you face to face with the frustration that you're going to feel within yourself because you don't have what you need to know, that you don't have the power that you wish you have. And so it is a kind of unselfing that has to happen. It's a kind of submission to processes beyond your understanding and beyond your power that you have to submit to. And that's a very difficult thing to do because we live in a world where all of the premium is upon exercising your control over others, getting the output that you most want. Right? You can talk about the whole of modern society as an effort to optimize opportunities. And the way you best optimize is by making sure that you control all the variables along the way to your optimization of whatever possibility you're trying to pursue. But this is the exact opposite of that. It's not you trying to take control of a situation. It's about putting yourself in the position of a student who has to now say, I have to submit to the reality that is before me. I have to be prepared for significant disappointment, sometimes major disappointment. And you have to submit to this possibility that you are just a small part of a much larger process. And all of those, are traits that are characteristic of the dark night that different saints have talked about in sort of more spiritual terms, where you have to give up the confidence that you had. You have to learn to be humble. You need to learn various ascetical practices so that you don't presume upon a world that often is much, much more complicated, certainly always more mysterious, but also, I think, more sacred than we're often prepared to admit.
Thanks. That's really excellent. I guess also, I guess we've this year had loads of slugs. Can you have hope in a world where slugs are eating all your brassica?
Yeah, there's a great thing to do with slugs. And I had to learn this from my mother because I was too dumb to know this. But she said, when you got slugs and they're going to come eat your strawberries or whatever, that's what they did to me. She said, just take the lid of a jar or something like that and fill it with beer and put it on the ground. And the slug will climb into there and in drinking the beer will also drown. And if you're a slug, that's the best way to go.
We've definitely tried that in our garden as well. I'm going to call on Jonathan, and then we'll have a question from Will. So we've got two questions. So Jonathan, do you want to unmute and ask a question?
I think I am unmuted. Can you
There
hear
you
me?
go. Yeah, we can hear
Yeah,
you.
thank you. Okay, so following on from the Greenbelt Festival, which some of us went to earlier in the year, on my book list for Christmas, because my family always find it difficult to know what to buy for me, is a book called The Death of Omnipotence and Birth of Amipotence by Thomas Ord. And he is arguing that God is not all powerful, but that it's actually the uncontrolling love of God which we need to understand. And this is a different way compared to standard theology over decades and centuries. So I just wondered if, for the sake of argument, God is not in control, but allows us to find the way of love, and he doesn't know what's going to happen. She doesn't know what's going to happen. They don't know what's going to happen. What does that mean for hope?
Yeah, wow, that's such a great question. And we would want to take a lot more time to parse this out because there's a number of deep theological questions in play in your question. So, on the one hand, there's no question that I remain committed to the power of God as the source of not just the creation of the world, but also its healing and its redemption, right? That new creation that we are moving toward is entirely a feature of God's love for creatures. But then we have to ask the very important question, well, what kind of power is this love that creates and sustains and heals and resurrects? And the thing to say about it is not the kind of power that works like a puppeteer controlling the strings that move the things of this world. And this is something that is pretty standard within theological accounts, and we have to then spend a little bit of time talking about how the concepts we use when talking about God, we speak analogically, right? Because the power of God is never to be equated with simply whatever we understand human power to be, then ratcheted up to the biggest, baddest kind of power you could think of.
Hmm.
Because the kinds of power that we're most interested in are the powers of control. And that would be a disaster if we thought that God is the ultimate controller of the universe. It introduces so many theological problems that we would need to take a fair amount of time to discuss. But I think the clearest indication of why that conception of power as simply human control magnified to the utmost is that Jesus, in his own way of being in the world, which is the fully divine way of being expressed on earth in bodily form, it's not a controlling power, right? The love of Jesus
Hmm.
for others is never coercive, it's never controlling, it's never manipulative, it's invitational, but in its manner, it has the power to heal. It has the power to feed. It has the power to reconcile. It has the power to resurrect, right? Which is the kind of power that I think is the power of hope, right? And so we don't obviously know when we commit ourselves to the healing of a community how that is going to play because we're not Jesus, right? We don't have the fullness of God's life and essence in any of us. But what we have is the assurance that, the resurrection is an event that shows that violence and death uh, cannot defeat this power of love that Jesus manifests in his own existence. So it's a power, the power that inspires and maintains, animates our hope is the power of this love, but it's not a power that is controlling. And I think I'll stop there because we could go for another lengthy
Thank
time
you.
on that. I hope that's helpful to you, Jonathan.
Thank you. It is. Thank you.
That was really great. So I think we've got time for one more question, and this is from Will. Will writes, related to this reflection on cultivating, I really enjoyed your book, Food and Faith. In your new book, do you write about examples of hope making a difference in our broken food and farming systems?
Yeah, I do. It's in the chapter on belonging, where I talk about my own experience growing up farming and how the work of growing food, tending to animals was a work that absolutely bound me to a place and to a set of practices, and how, on the one hand, that could be utterly beautiful, as when, we would have, pigs that were sows giving birth to piglets or cows giving birth to calves, or being out in a field and seeing a red-tailed hawk or pronghorn antelope, or seeing beautiful sunrise, right? All those things are just beautiful gifts that come from doing the work of tending land and animals. But it was also utterly frustrating at times because, again, you're dealing with animals that can be recalcitrant, or that who are just obstinate and can even hurt you if you get in their way, or that you're having to deal with so much death, or that you're having to do the work in really inclement weather, even hostile weather. Right. So the belonging to land and the belonging to the practices of nurture are, on the one hand, utterly beautiful and utterly, utterly humiliating. And I give a couple of stories, even humorous stories, about how how that humiliation in the work is nonetheless really important. But then I say something really, really important in this chapter, which is that when we give ourselves to the care of plants and fields and animals, and we could extend it to forests and neighborhoods, what we do is we invest our love in the place. And in investing our love, we participate in the healing of those places, the beautification of those places, which have the effect of wanting us to be more closely drawn to them, right? I talk about my grandfather, who was a very important influence on me. And, this is a man who came out of Central Europe during the Second World War, and so witnessed unspeakable barbarity and cruelty. Um, his own family suffered incredibly, right, in ways that even defy our speaking, I would say. And yet, when they moved to Western Canada and started to farm, he modeled a gentle way of being in which he showed himself to the land as one who wanted to be a participant in its fertility, in supporting its nurture and growth. And so we lived in the shadow of the Canadian Rockies, which are beautiful, magnificent to go to be in. but he rarely wanted to go because he didn't want to leave his farm, because he saw the farm as the place where he experienced the love of God. And what he most wanted to do was join his love in the forms of very important practical skills, right? He wanted to join his love to the love that is operating there. And so in the chapter, I end by talking about the importance of community farms, community gardens in urban, suburban, village contexts. Those exercises become so important. And you have a writer in England, Sue Stuart Smith, who's written a wonderful book called The Well-Gardened Mind, where she's a psychologist, but also a very experienced gardener. And she brings so much social scientific literature to bear on the healing properties of gardening work, being in gardens for people who are dealing with so many stresses, personal anxiety, traumatic disorder symptoms that, many veterans, for instance, experience. And she, agrees that, gardens don't solve every problem, and they certainly shouldn't be viewed as a substitute for professional care. But even so, she talks about how these gardens in different communities play the role of healing individuals, but also the communities. Because when people gather in garden spaces, they come to better sympathy and understanding of each other, and the kinds of suspicion that often create difficulties in neighborhoods. They don't always disappear, but they certainly decrease. And people find that their communities are places that can love them, right? So she tells stories about a veteran who goes into a garden who's only felt shame because of the horrible things he did in war. And he comes into the garden, he says, I don't have to feel shame here because the plants don't judge me. And if I take care of them, I get to enjoy a beautiful flower. It's a pretty amazing thing.
That's beautiful. The common grace of land for all. It's a great example of God's grace for us all. Norman, I just want to say thank you so much. It's just so exciting, and now just so even more excited to be able to access your book in January. So I encourage everyone else as well. Before we leave, I'm going to stop the recording a second, but I just want to announce one quick announcement, and that's that we have our first in-person conference coming up on the 30th of September to the 2nd of October next year, 2025. It's called Landscapes. And the idea is really to do more of what we're doing tonight, but where we are literally a conference, imagine a conference in a community garden, where you have your hands in the soil, where you're processing and thinking deeply alongside engaging directly with nature and bringing those things together in very creative ways. So save the date for Landscapes. We are going to be doing more promotion of that next year. But everyone, a really big thank you to Norman again. Thank you so much, Norman. We really appreciate you coming.
Thank you all. Very, very, very good to be with you tonight.
Thank you very much.